The IRS walked into my brother's wedding reception and froze every account he owned before the cake was even cut. I know because I watched the news alerts scroll across my phone screen from a hammock in Sedona, 3 states away, with a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand and absolutely nowhere to be. I wasn't invited. Let me back up. I found out my brother was getting married the same way I find out most things about my family these days, not from them. It was a Tuesday in March, and I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen counter after a 12-hour shift when my coworker texted me a screenshot. She'd been scrolling Facebook and recognized my brother's face from the one photo I kept on my desk. The post was public. A sunset photo. Him and his fiancée on a pier somewhere, her ring catching the light like it was staged, which it probably was. The caption read, "She said yes," followed by a string of heart emojis and 100 comments from people I'd never heard of. I read the caption twice. Then I set my spoon down very carefully and stared at the wall for a look. My brother and I share a mother, a last name, and approximately 11 years of history where I functioned as something between a parent and a safety net. Our mother was diagnosed with early-onset MS when I was 19 and he was 12. I was already in college on a partial scholarship, working 2 jobs, sending money home when I could. When it became clear she couldn't manage alone, I transferred to a state school closer to home, switched my major from pre-law to accounting because it was faster and more employable, and moved back into the house on Birchwood Avenue that smelled like lavender candles and old carpet. I did not resent it. That's the part people always expect me to say and then clarify. I didn't resent taking care of my mother. I didn't resent the scholarships I didn't apply for, the graduate program I deferred and never returned to, the years I filed taxes and managed insurance claims and drove to pharmacy pickups at 7 in the morning before my own shift started. What I resented, what built up so slowly I didn't even name it until much later, was being treated like infrastructure, like a bridge people drive over every day without thinking about how it stays standing. My brother got to be a kid through most of it. I made sure of that deliberately. He had his soccer seasons and his prom and his gap year road trip and his attempt at culinary school in Nashville that didn't work out, and his move back home at 23 with credit card debt I helped him restructure. When he decided he wanted to open a restaurant, I was the one who co-signed the small business loan. I was the one who sat across from the bank officer and walked through his 5-year projection. I was the one who spent 3 weekends building out his accounting infrastructure because he didn't want to pay for a bookkeeper, and I was right there. He called me his secret weapon. He said it in toasts, at family dinners, to strangers at the bar after the restaurant started doing well. "She's the reason any of this works." He meant it warmly. I know he did. But there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being someone's reason and never being someone's call. I texted him the night I saw the Facebook post. "Congratulations. When did this happen?" He responded 20 minutes later with a string of exclamation points and the date of the engagement 4 months ago and a photo of the ring. 4 months. I had seen him at Christmas. I had transferred money to cover a walk-in refrigeration repair in January. 4 months, and not a word. I asked, gently, whether there was a wedding planned. He said yes, actually, June. And then there was a pause in the text thread that lasted long enough that I understood it wasn't a technical delay. He typed for a while. The ellipsis appeared and disappeared twice before his message came through. He said his fiancée wanted something really intimate, just immediate family and close friends. He said she felt like big gatherings made the day less meaningful. He said he hoped I understood. It wasn't personal. He loved me. He just had to respect what she needed. I typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. Then I wrote, "I understand. Take care of yourself." And I put the phone face down on the counter and went to bed at 8:30 in the evening like a person whose chest had not just quietly caved in. His fiancée and I had met 4 times. The first time she was charming and laughed at everything and ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and didn't offer to split the bill. The second time she mentioned, twice, that my job in forensic accounting sounded exhausting and she didn't know how I dealt with all that negativity all day. The third time, she pulled my brother aside at his own restaurant and they had a conversation near the host stand that ended with him coming back to the table quieter. The fourth time was Christmas, and she spent most of it talking to my mother and not making eye contact with me. None of that was why I was worried about her. I was worried about her because of Marcus. Marcus was her business partner and the person who had introduced her to my brother 3 years ago. He was also the co-owner of a property management company that had been flagged in a regional audit I'd come across through a professional development seminar in October. The name rang a bell. I spent a weekend doing what I do, pulling public filings, cross-referencing LLCs, tracing what could be traced. What I found wasn't a smoking gun. It was a pattern. Entities created and dissolved in a rhythm that suggested someone moving money faster than revenue could explain. Her name was listed as a registered agent on 2 of the dissolved companies. Whether she knew what Marcus was doing or was simply adjacent to it, I couldn't say for certain. I told my brother in November. I sat across from him at his own bar after closing time and I laid it out calmly. The way I do things, no accusations, just documentation. This is what I found. I think you should know. He listened. He nodded. He said he'd look into it. 2 weeks later, he stopped returning my calls for 10 days. When he finally picked up, he said his fiancée felt like I was trying to sabotage their relationship because I'd never approved of her. He said I had always had a way of making things about facts when they were really about feelings. He said he needed me to respect his choices. I said I understood. I said I was sorry for upsetting him. I said I would drop it. I did not drop it. In February, I submitted a detailed file to the IRS whistleblower program. I used a separate, encrypted email I created for the purpose. I attached everything I'd documented: the entity registrations, the dissolution patterns, the revenue discrepancies I'd found in a business filing that was publicly available. I did not include my name. I did not tell anyone. I submitted it, and then I closed the browser, and I made dinner, and I watched television, and I did not feel righteous or satisfied. I felt tired in the specific way you feel when you've done the right thing that no one will ever thank you for. 3 weeks later, my brother called to tell me about the wedding and that I wasn't invited, and I said I understood. I booked a flight to Sedona on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't compare prices. I found a casita rental with thick adobe walls and a private patio facing a canyon that looked like something a painter had invented, and I put my card down without doing the math. I submitted a vacation request at work and packed a bag that evening: jeans, linen shirts, my worn-out hiking sandals, the small leather journal I'd been carrying around half-empty for 2 years. I didn't tell my mother where I was going. I texted her that I was taking some time, that I would be reachable if there was a medical need, and that I loved her. She responded with a question mark, and then nothing. I left Friday morning. The drive from the Phoenix airport to Sedona takes about 2 hours if you don't stop. I stopped twice. Once for gas and a terrible coffee. Once because I pulled off at a viewpoint I'd read about and stood at the railing for a long time, looking out at red rock formations rising up from the desert like something the earth had decided was important. The air smelled like juniper and dry heat and something older than anything I could name. I took a photo and then immediately felt foolish about it, and then posted it anyway because I didn't care about looking foolish right now. The casita was small and perfect. Terracotta tiles, a Kiva fireplace I wouldn't need, windows on 3 sides, and a patio with 2 chairs facing the canyon that turned pink and copper at dusk. The host had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, make yourself at home," with a bar of local chocolate and a handwritten list of hiking trails. I stood in the kitchen for a moment reading it. No one had left me a welcome note in a long time. That first night I sat on the patio until the stars came out, which in Sedona is a production. I hadn't seen that many stars since the one camping trip my family took before everything changed. I thought about my brother. Not with anger, I'd moved past anger somewhere over the desert from 30,000 feet. What I felt was closer to grief. Not for the wedding I wasn't attending. For the brother who used to call me when he burned dinner or got a bad review or was scared about the loan payment. The one who called me his secret weapon like it meant something. That version of him felt very far away. I didn't sleep well the first night, but I didn't expect to. I lay in the dark listening to absolute silence, which is its own kind of noise when you're not used to it. In the morning I walked down to the small cafe at the edge of town before anything else was open. I ordered an Americano and a breakfast pastry and sat outside at a wooden table while the canyon slowly filled with light. A dog trotted past with no owner and glanced at me with the specific confidence of an animal that belonged entirely to itself. A couple at the next table was arguing softly about a hiking trail, pointing at a map, And then the woman laughed at something and they were fine. Life moved around me with no knowledge of my family, no memory of what I had or hadn't been included in, no expectation of anything from me at all. I opened my journal. I hadn't written in it in months. The last entry was from November, the night I got home from telling my brother about Marcus. I read it and then turned to a fresh page and wrote, "I am here because they made it easy to leave. That's not the same as wanting to go." I stayed at that table for 2 hours. I ordered a second coffee. No one rushed me. The days in Sedona had a quality I hadn't felt since before my mother got sick, a slowness that wasn't laziness, a silence that wasn't absence. I hiked in the mornings, easy trails at first, longer ones as my legs remembered what they were for. I ate when I was hungry. I read half a novel I'd been carrying in my bag for 8 months. I posted photos occasionally to my Instagram, not for them, exactly, but not for them either. The canyon at sunrise, my hiking boots on red dirt, a cup of tea on the patio at dusk, the shadows long and orange across the tile. I checked the viewer list once, my mother, my aunt, my brother's fiancé, which surprised me until I remembered she had no reason to know what she was looking at. No one messaged, no one commented, but they saw it. They saw me standing somewhere outside the world they had built without me, taking up space, existing completely apart from any function they'd assigned me. It was enough. I put the phone down and went back to my book. On the 4th day, I woke before sunrise without an alarm and lay in the dark for a while thinking about Marcus. I hadn't let myself think carefully about what might happen. I didn't know the timeline of an IRS investigation. I had no insight into what they would find beyond what I'd submitted, and I had made a deliberate decision not to obsess over it. I had handed the truth to the people whose job it was to handle it, and I had let it go. But that morning I felt something different. An alertness, almost like a held breath. I got up and made coffee and sat on the patio in the pre-dawn dark and waited for the sun without knowing quite what I was waiting for. The wedding was that day. A Saturday in June, somewhere in the hill country outside Austin. I knew the venue from the one time my brother had mentioned it, carefully, with the specific casualness of someone managing information. Outdoor ceremony, string lights, a catering team from a restaurant Marcus partly owned. I drank my coffee and watched the canyon walls go from black to purple to rose. I wrote one line in my journal. Today my brother gets married, and I am not there. I wonder who sees the shape I used to fill. After breakfast, I drove down into town and walked along the main stretch of shops and galleries, not buying anything, just moving through the morning like a person with nowhere urgent to be. I went into a small bookshop and stood in the local authors section for a long time. I bought a collection of desert essays by a woman I'd never heard of. The bookseller asked if I was visiting and I said yes, taking a little time, and she smiled and said the town was good for that. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I was walking back to the car. My college roommate, the closest thing I had to a best friend during a period when I didn't have much time for friendship. She sent 2 messages in quick succession. The first one said, "Hey, are you seeing the news?" The second one said, "Isn't that your brother's fiancé's business?" I sat down on a bench outside a turquoise jewelry shop and opened the link she'd sent. The headline was not subtle. Austin area property management firm under federal investigation, co-owner arrested on charges of tax fraud, money laundering. There was a photo of Marcus outside what looked like a county building, a sport coat, his face turned slightly away from the camera. The article was 6 paragraphs. The third one mentioned that the firm's assets had been frozen as of that morning pending investigation. The fourth one noted that a secondary registered agent, his business partner, was cooperating with authorities. I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and sat very still on that bench for a while, watching a crow investigate something near a planter box across the street. I wasn't surprised. That's the thing about working in forensic accounting for 7 years. You develop an instinct for what a pattern is hiding, and you know when you're right, even when no one believes you yet. I had been right. I had told my brother I was right in the gentlest terms I could manage, and he had chosen to hear it as jealousy, and I had filed a federal report and flown to Arizona, and here we were. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad in a way that sat low in my stomach, not sharp, just there. Because somewhere in Austin right now my brother's wedding had either just collapsed or was in the process of collapsing. And regardless of everything, he was still my brother, and I knew what it felt like to watch something you built fall apart. My phone started ringing while I was still sitting on the bench. I looked at the screen. My mother. I let it ring. Then my aunt. Then a number I didn't recognize with an Austin area code. Then my mother again. I walked back to the casita slowly. The sun was high now, the red rocks stark and brilliant against a cloudless sky, 2 hawks circling something far above the canyon floor. I went inside and filled a glass of water and stood at the window drinking it, looking out at all that motionless landscape. When I felt ready, I tapped the voicemail from my mother. Her voice was different from how it usually sounded, not the careful, composed tone she used with doctors and neighbors, but something rawer, like a thread pulled too tight. She said my brother's name. She said there were people, officials, that the venue had been a disaster, that his fiancé's partner had been arrested that morning and somehow it had reached the ceremony before it even started. She said my brother was devastated and not speaking. She said things were a mess and she didn't know what to do, and she knew I was away, but she needed me to call. She ended the message with, "You always know what to do." I played it once. Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there in the quiet of the casita for a long time. You always know what to do. I thought about every time that sentence had been the reason I didn't get to not know what to do. Every time a crisis became my responsibility by default, because I was the capable one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to absorb and fix and manage, and not ask for anything afterward. I thought about the co-signed loan, the restructured debt, the 3 weekends I spent building an accounting system for a restaurant I'd never been thanked for publicly. I thought about November, sitting across from my brother at his own bar with documents spread out between us, trying to protect him, and being accused of sabotage. They hadn't needed me when the wedding was being planned. They hadn't needed me when the guest list was being trimmed. They hadn't thought of me when they chose a venue catered by a company tied to a man I had explicitly warned them about. But now, with officials involved and everything fracturing, I was the one who always knew what to do. I picked up the phone and listened to my aunt's voicemail next. She was crying, which was unusual. She said my brother's fiancé had left the venue before the ceremony was finished. She said guests were confused. She said my mother looked pale. She asked me to come home. My roommate's next text read, "Are you okay? Does your family know you were in Sedona when this happened?" I wrote back, "I'm okay, and no, and I'd like to keep it that way for now." She sent a single, "Understood." I made tea. The kettle was a cheap electric one that took forever, the kind that makes you stand at the counter waiting instead of walking away. I stood there and watched the steam rise and thought about all the things I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to drive to the airport and reroute myself to Austin. I wasn't going to call my brother tonight while he was still in the center of the shock. I wasn't going to be the bridge again, the one who absorbs both sides, translates the damage, makes the path back to normal seem shorter than it is. Not because I didn't love him, because love had been doing too much of their heavy lifting for too long, and the weight of it had already changed my shape in ways I was only beginning to understand. I took the tea out to the patio and sat in the late afternoon light. The canyon was deep red now, the shadows long and dramatic, the kind of beauty that doesn't ask you to do anything with it. A lizard appeared on the low wall beside me, considered me briefly, and then went about its business. The air was cooling at the edges. I opened my journal and wrote, "They called when the scaffolding fell. Not when they were building something I should have been part of. Not when they made decisions that affected me. Not when they needed me to feel like a person and not a resource. They called when they needed the function and confused that with missing me." I paused and looked out at the canyon. I am not the emergency contact for their consequences. My brother called at 6:15 that evening. I watched the screen light up and then go dark. He called again at 6:40. At 7, a text came through. "Please pick up. I need to talk to you." I picked up the phone, held it for a moment, and then put it down. Not because I was punishing him. I want to be clear about that, because I spent a long time asking myself that question in the hours that followed, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Was this revenge? Was this cruelty dressed up as self-preservation? I didn't think so. I was 31 years old and I had spent most of my adult life being the person who picked up every call, who showed up to every crisis, who absorbed every fallout without complaint, and I had done it without anyone asking me to because it was simply who I was. And the cost of being that person had been so gradual, so distributed across so many small moments of being overlooked or excluded or managed, that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I'd spent. I wasn't going to heal that by picking up the phone tonight. In the morning I drove out to a trailhead I hadn't tried yet, one that wound up through the red rocks to a ridge with a long view. It was harder than the trail description suggested, and I was breathing hard by the halfway point, but I kept going, stopping at intervals to look back at how far I'd come. The sky was wide and bright and completely indifferent to anything happening 3 states away. At the top, I sat on a flat boulder and drank from my water bottle and thought about Marcus. He'd probably cooperate. People like Marcus always cooperated. His fiancée might too, or she might have known enough to claim she didn't know enough. My brother had been adjacent to all of it through the restaurant, through the catering arrangement, through years of Marcus being in his circle. He might have some uncomfortable conversations ahead. I hoped he had a good accountant. I hoped, not bitterly but genuinely, that he came through it without losing what he'd built. I hoped he understood someday why I had done what I did. My phone had 12 unread messages when I came back to cell service near the trailhead parking lot. I sat in the rental car with the air conditioning running and read through them. My mother, asking where I was. My aunt, twice. My brother, 4 times. The last one simply, I know you're angry. I understand. But I need you to know I'm sorry. I wasn't angry. That was what was hard to explain. Anger would have been simpler, a clear emotion with a clear object. What I felt was more like the aftermath of a long exhaustion finally being permitted to surface. Like muscles finally being allowed to rest after years of holding a shape they were never designed to hold permanently. I wrote back to my brother. 1 message, carefully considered. I said, I'm not angry. I'm taking care of myself for a little while. When I'm ready to talk, I will call you. I need you to let me decide when that is. He replied within 30 seconds. Okay. I love you. I didn't respond to that. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I needed love to stop being the reason I rearranged myself. That afternoon I drove to a gallery I'd walked past twice, and finally went inside. A woman was showing large format photographs of the desert at different hours, the same formations in different light, and I stood in front of one for a very long time, a pre-dawn shot where everything was still gray-blue, and the rocks looked like they were waiting for something. The photographer was in the gallery, and she came over eventually and asked what I thought. I said it looked like patience. She said that was the best description she'd ever heard of it. I bought a small print, the first art I'd bought in 5 years. I figured I'd find a place to put it. I had 2 more days in Sedona after that. I used them slowly. I finished the desert essays. I went back to the cafe and sat at the same outside table 2 mornings in a row, and the same young man working the counter nodded at me like I was a regular, which I was not, but the fiction of it felt good. I called my mother once, briefly. She cried. I listened. I told her I was okay and I was taking some time and I would call again soon. She said she didn't understand what I was doing. I said I know. I told her I loved her and said goodbye. I didn't call anyone else. On my last evening in Sedona, I sat on the patio until full dark came in, and the stars appeared again, the whole impossible quantity of them, and I thought about all the versions of the next year. My brother would likely lose the catering arrangement. He might lose more, depending on how close his business had gotten to Marcus's money. He was going to need help, maybe, and I was going to have to decide very carefully what kind of help I was willing to give, and on what terms, and from what position. Not because I didn't want to help him, because I needed help to be a choice I made, not a default I fell into. The difference mattered more than I could have explained a year ago. I opened my journal to the last used page and read back through everything I'd written since arriving. The lines surprised me, not because they were profound, but because they were honest in a way my writing rarely was. I'd spent so long managing information for other people that I'd forgotten how to just say a true thing plainly. The journal was full of plain, true things. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed that. I wrote one final entry for the trip. I didn't address it to anyone. I wrote, "I am not leaving because I stopped loving them. I am leaving because love is not a job description, and I kept treating it like one. I came here to remember that I exist outside of what I do for people." I think I remembered. I underlined the last sentence and closed the journal. On the drive back to Phoenix in the morning, the desert was gold and enormous on every side. The highway straight and clear, almost no other cars. I had a flight in the afternoon. I had a job I was good at. I had an apartment with a kitchen I liked, and a cat who had been with a friend for a week and probably hadn't noticed my absence in any meaningful way, which I found comforting rather than sad. I had a brother who was going to call me when the dust settled, and I was going to answer when I was ready, and we were going to have a conversation that was different from every conversation we'd had before. Harder, more honest, less arranged around what I was willing to absorb. I didn't know if that conversation would go well. I knew I needed it to happen on my terms, in my time, from a place where I had already taken care of myself first, instead of last. I stopped at a roadside spot about an hour out of Sedona, a pullover with a low wall, and a view of the desert stretching out flat and rust-colored to a range of mountains in the far distance. I got out, and stood in the wind, and took one photo. No filter, no caption, just the desert, and the light, and the far-off mountains looking exactly like what they were. I posted it and put my phone in my pocket and stood there for another few minutes, just feeling the wind and not needing to be anywhere or anyone in particular. Then I got back in the car and drove toward home. Not because they needed me, because I was ready. And that, finally, was the difference. If you've ever been the person your family calls in a crisis but somehow doesn't think of when they're celebrating, if you've ever been managed out of a room that should have had your name on the guest list, if you've ever told the truth and been called dramatic for it, and then watched the truth arrive anyway, without you, on its own schedule, you are not invisible. You are not wrong for remembering what you were worth to them. And you are not obligated to be the one who cleans up the mess made by people who forgot to include you in the first place. Drop a comment if any of this hit close to home. I'd love to know I'm not the only one.